open science tools and practices in Canadian neuroscience research. After years of writing about open science and IP, Dylan's unique background enables him to identify critical challenges in open science and propose innovative solutions. Before we start, I just wanted to mention that we have these flyers on the tables here that you can take a look at, and they are promoting, I guess, also for people on Zoom. It's just a promotion of the one-year mentorship program for the Douglas Open Science Committee. And so it's the Science Awards. So it's $5,000 towards your open science project. So you can learn more by scanning the QR code or just Googling it online if you're on Zoom, or maybe we can pop something in the chat there. Okay, perfect. So take it away, Dylan. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation. That makes me sound way more important than I really am, but I guess that's how these things go. Like you said, my name is Dylan Roskams-Edris. My current role is as network lead for Conscience. I wanted to say a couple of things about how I got to where I am. The organizers asked me to say one or two things about how I came to be in the current role. So I started out with a neuroscience degree from McGill. So spent many good years in Montreal, loved the city, didn't make it out into the French parts of it enough, but I tried to remedy that a little later. Realized that lab work wasn't necessarily for me after going from I did some work in a yeast lab and then a mouse lab and then with human data. I took a class in my last year of undergrad about neuroethics. I thought that ethics, this was something that I could really get a handle in. It's something not about developing the technology itself, but how we might go about using them and how it would impact society. So I went to do a master's degree of health ethics at Memorial University of Newfoundland. Highly recommend MUN, highly recommend Newfoundland. If you ever go visit, I recommend visiting in August or September. Those are the 2 months where you're least likely to get a blizzard. Not impossible, but least likely to get a blizzard. They're the friendliest people in the history of the world. While I was doing that degree, I found all of it really, really interesting, but I didn't think it had enough of an impact on the real world. There's a lot of what ethicists do is just talk to one another and write papers. I think there's probably some people who can relate to that. So I decided that law was where I would go after that. Went to law school. In law school, I thought I was going to concentrate on criminal law. When I was there, I encountered intellectual property. I realized that based on my scientific background, if I was actually going to have an impact on the world around me, intellectual property was the way that I was best suited to be able to contribute. Now, the problem is that generally, if you're in law school and you're interested in intellectual property, the thing to do is become an IP attorney. If you were to create a list of the top 10 people you wouldn't want to get a phone call from, intellectual property attorney is one of the top. So I was trying to figure out after law school, how could I use my expertise in intellectual property while at the same time not locking down knowledge, being the kind of person that when someone picks up the phone, they smile rather than cringe. So I found open science through some of my connections. Then I started working with the Canadian Open Neuroscience platform. They brought me on to write their publication and commercialization policy. So I spent a year doing that, which is fantastic. It was a year about being able to learn about all of the different aspects about open science that I hadn't learned before. It was a fantastic opportunity. I went from that to become the Open Science Alliance officer at the Tanenbaum Open Science Institute. I was there right at the very beginning of the Douglas, working on its open science efforts. While I was there, I started interacting with the Hotchkiss and with CAMH and with Baycrest, where I'll be tomorrow, and with the UBC Malphagian Institute. And now, after all of these years, and I've handed off the reins to Gabriel Pelletier, who was there at the time, he was hired at the time, they've all agreed to adopt open science principles. I'm super duper happy for them, and I'm really glad that that original work has led me to not only give this talk today, but eventually into my role at Conscience. I come to you today not so much in my day-to-day professional guise, which is mainly going and talking to people about data, about drug discovery, about AI, sometimes about intellectual property. I come to you more as someone who has spent a long time staring at science, and intellectual property and collaboration and trying to figure out a way that they can mesh together in such a way that they'll be mutually reinforcing rather than butting heads against one another, because that's the story that often gets told. But in my experience, there's often a lack of knowledge on the part of the people doing science about how intellectual property can impact the way that they work and how it can play a role or not in translating those discoveries to actually having an impact on the world around them, which is kind of odd when you think about it, because when essentially every single drug that gets approved by the FDA or by Health Canada gets its start in academic research, you can trace their lineage back. The original discoveries that led to all of them find their way from academic research into the real world and eventually into the lives of patients. The people who are actually creating those discoveries are not educated in their degrees about how intellectual property can play a role in what they do, how it structures and hits and touches literally everything you do in science. There's a role that intellectual property plays. So, and this is even more true in the world of open science. So what I hope to do today with this talk is to hit a couple of major points. One, to give you a little bit of context around intellectual property itself, what it is, what the different forms are, and how it touches on what you do as researchers. I then want to talk about how open science has kind of complicated this relationship. And ultimately, my goal is, when you think about translation, I want you to think about your values, and I want you to think about an open mindset. Because when it comes to figuring out how you want your work to impact the world around you, there has never been a better time for getting your work from where you are out into the world and having an actual impact. There's never been more paths for that to happen. But if you don't have the grounding and the context and the mindset, it's very difficult to understand and to ask the right questions. So what I'm hoping to do is to do that. I know it's a bit of a tall order, but we'll see what we can do. So if you look at some headlines, especially in my world right now, which is drug discovery, and often with universities, you see some kind of depressing things. At the conference that I just organized, the Conscience Symposium on Open Drug Discovery that was just taking place over the course of the last 2 days, multiple people talked about that graph up in the top right-hand corner, Arum's law. If you're familiar with Moore's law, which is an exponential that goes up, saying that our processing capacity doubles basically every 2 years, it's an exponential. This is the inverse of that. It means that the cost of developing a drug, every new drug that gets developed over time costs exponentially more money over time, which means that our innovation capacity is decreasing. It's becoming more and more costly over time to get the same number of drugs and get the same health impact into people. You're also hearing, and I've said this many, many times in talks before, that universities often lose money when it comes to tech transfer, and this is broadly true. Generally speaking, as with so many things in life, there are a couple of core institutions, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, MIT, Stanford, that are able to get positive returns, and so the rich get richer, but the poor also get poorer. So these are kind of depressing statistics and depressing ideas. But I want to come back to what I just said, which is that there's never been a better time for getting your research out there, especially if you can approach what you're doing with an open mindset. Now, when I give a talk, I love giving talks like this. I really like to start from very basic principles. I'm sorry if some of this that comes up seems extremely basic, but I really like to start right at the very bottom and build up in as many iterative layers as we possibly can. So when we're doing science, what are we doing? What are we even doing? This is my answer to that question. I'm not saying it's a universal question. I'm not saying Karl Popper's ghost would be happy with what I'm saying right here. But I think what you're doing is you're testing a hypothesis to see whether it is unlikely to be due to a coincidence, which is another way of saying you're finding reasonably reliable cause and effect relationships that exist out in the universe around us. When we find a cause and effect relationship that doesn't have a direct application, there's no way of us being able to say we're going to we're going to take this cause and effect relationship and have an effect out in the world around it. We're going to use it to produce something. We call it basic science. It's just a word that we've decided to use. It's just a term we've decided to apply to this particular area of scientific knowledge. When you can take that cause and effect relationship and apply it to create some kind of change in the world around you, we call it applied science. It's just the actualization or the implementation of a cause and effect relationship to cause some kind of effect out in the world. When we talk about tech transfer, it's trying to take some of that applied knowledge and take it out into the world so that it can have an impact. Once again, starting from basic principles, how can we do that? How can we go from this little box that we call academia and have an actual impact out in the world around you? Well, there's three basic ways. This is my taxonomy. You can communicate it, you can use it, and then try to get others to use it, or you can share the underlying information upon which your hypothesis, your cause and effect relationship that you've discovered exists. Each of those different high-level categories of activities relates to different forms of intellectual property. So when you want to communicate something, for example, so we can map them onto intellectual property. When you want to write something, whether you're writing a paper, writing a textbook, writing anything, as long as you apply a modicum of creativity to it, you get an automatic copyright in it. When you try to use something and get others to use it, when you're developing a technology, it doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't matter whether it's a piece of hardware, whether it's a reagent, a plasmid, a mouse line, doesn't matter. And you want others to use it, the type of intellectual property that would apply there is called a patent. When you want to share the underlying information, which could be all sorts of things, but for this talk, I'm mainly going to concentrate on data, you'd be using a trade secret. You can see a lot of different definitions of intellectual property, but the most basic understanding of intellectual property is it's a bunch of laws that we've decided to put into place to take knowledge, which is generally considered to be a public good. That's a term of art. It's a piece of jargon that we use to say it's a good that multiple people can use at the same time and that doesn't degrade as more people use it. You can compare, for example, a hammer, which only one person can use at a time, and which, as you continue to use it, might break or degrade or chip or something along those lines, with the idea of how to put a hammer together, which anybody can use to create a hammer, and which, in fact, the more people use it, and this is true in science, generally, the better it gets. The more people who can critique it and adapt it and build off of it, the better the hammers get, and you get a proliferation of different types of hammers out in the world. What intellectual property does is to try to take that second type of good, the knowledge, and say, okay, in order for us to promote innovation, what we need to do is give someone the right to say, no, you are not allowed to use this particular type of knowledge. Or you have to, without paying me. You're not allowed to use it in the market. It's turning it into a piece of property to try to activate knowledge in the market itself. If we want to try to map those three high-level categories onto the types of things that you're generally doing in a research environment, or the kinds of things that you're encouraged to do in an academic environment, we have communicate it. You can write a paper, you can write a textbook, you can give an interview, you can present at a conference. These are the kinds of ways that, at least in the traditional model, we've had of communicating our research to one another, and then also out. Sometimes you give an interview. We can use it and try to get others to use it. One of the ways that we try to do that is to, if let's say I've discovered some kind of really useful plasmid that can be used to create a biologic drug, we try to get a patent over it. And then when you get a patent over it, that should give you the leverage, and I'll go a little bit more into this later, in order to either start a company yourself or license that knowledge so that somebody else can do it. Or you can, and that's what we have tended to mean in the past when we talk about translation and tech transfer. One little bullet point right there. You can send something directly to others. This happens all the time in research. You've discovered something super cool in your lab. One of your colleagues says like, oh, that's a super cool thing I read about in your paper. Can you send me a copy of it? You put it in a bunch of dry ice. Both of my parents are profs, so I always used to help my mom unpack like little sections of brain from dry ice in her lab and play with the cardboard. or you can share the underlying information. So you can send data to others when they request it. This once again happened all the time, even way, way back in the day. Or you can try to include all of the data in the paper itself. This is what people do when they say they're sharing all the data and they have like a table or a figure and an image, and they say that that's sharing the data that's underlying their results. But then open science happened, and the internet happened. Both of those things kind of happened at all of the same time. Make sure I'm still in the right place. And all of a sudden, there were so many more different channels of communication out into the world around you. We were taking those relatively limited sets of ways of taking information in one place and in one form and trying to put it somewhere else in another form so that it can be used. This is why we call it translation, right? Sometimes that word is a little bit mysterious, but all translation is you have something in one particular language or one particular form, and you want to take it, put it into another particular form so that other people can use it. That's why we use the word translation. I like to take a pretty expansive view of translation. And I use that particular figure of the open science buffet because it's my favorite way of talking about open science. A lot of the time when you hear people talk about open, it's the open science umbrella or something like that. But I find that those kinds of metaphors can often lead to people saying like either you're doing all of these things and therefore you're doing open science, or you're not doing all of these things and therefore you're not doing open science. Or my favorite approach to open science is, depending on who you are, there's a buffet. Maybe you go up and you want to take a little bit of preprint and a little bit of pre-registration and a little bit of data sharing, and you're going to go back and you're going to see how that tastes. And if it works well for you, then you'll go back, you might get seconds, get some more, or you want to go back there and be like, oh, Maxie, maybe there's a little bit of open source software sharing that I want to try a little bit of, or like, actually, I designed a piece of hardware, I designed a new different type of maze. Maybe I want to share that in the future. So it's a slow progression towards having the full meal of open science rather than you're with us, so you're against us, because that kind of stuff is just not particularly useful. And I think it's part of the open mindset. Having an open mindset doesn't just mean you do everything open. It means being open to people doing things in different ways and being compassionate for where people are and their priorities and their business and their busyness and all of that. Grab some water. I've been talking a lot in the last few days. I'm not going to be able to talk about all of this, nor I think do you have time for me to try to talk about all of this. I left it up there for a bit. I'm going to talk about some elements. If any of you are particularly interested in one of those elements and I don't talk about it, I would actually encourage you to, like, I don't know, take a picture or something right now or take a note of it. And during the question and answer period, which if I hustle a little bit, we should be able to get to, or maybe we can talk about it over pizza afterwards. What I'm going to do instead is pick a couple of case studies in intellectual property and how they've been transformed by open approaches to intellectual property and open science approaches to various different things. Talk about basically give a crash course in a couple of different types of intellectual property, how they came about, the various different bargains that were struck and why they exist, how they're justified. And then talk about a few interesting case studies and how they've kind of required different approaches to intellectual property and some of the strategies that people have employed. I'm going to talk about Creative Commons, a couple of alternatives to patents that I think you'll find relatively interesting, and then a little bit about trade secret, though that's not the most applicable for y'all. Okay, first, let's talk about copyright. Who here has heard of copyright before? Excellent. Who here has been to an intellectual property class at law school? Hey, okay, one. This is more or less what I thought the ratios would be. I'm not going to be able to give you an entire intro to intellectual property and copyright, but what I can give you is a little bit of an intro into how copyright works. The basic idea is that whenever you do something, whenever you create something creative, copyright is supposed to protect expression, supposed to protect creative works that people create. Whenever you do something with creativity, I don't care whether you're painting a picture, like the beautiful painting of the calla lilies at the back of this, or I can't turn around screen, but you'll just promise me that they're there, or whether you write a paper or a poem or any other creative work, design any type of chair, though then we'd have to get into design patents, and I'll leave that aside for now. It's automatically covered by copyright, which means that only the creator and the owner of that copyright has the right to copy, reproduce, or distribute that piece of that expressive work. This is a piece of property, so of course it can be sold. And we'll get into that in just a second. And copyright lasts a very long time. It varies depending on jurisdiction, but generally, intellectual property laws have been harmonized in a lot of different places in the world. And a good rule of thumb is that they tend to last for life of the author plus 50 to 70 years. So there are various services and RSS feeds and whatnot you can find online of like works that have just entered the public domain, which is a fancy way of saying copyright no longer applies. And we're looking at stuff that's like early 20th century. It's like you can go read like Mark Twain or whatever, but anything that came up from the 50s or something like that, no dice. And here's how we justify it, and here's how it impacts what you do as a researcher. So the deal, the copyright bargain, was whenever you publish a paper, or normally when you publish a paper, at least in the old days, or write a textbook, you get the copyright. You give that copyright to a publisher. The publisher gives you a way to distribute that information and those materials to an audience. And what you get in return is what you get in return is, well, access to those distribution channels. And what they get is the ability to make people pay for the end result of what gets distributed through those channels. This is the underlying justification. This is why copyright exists, so that artists can be rewarded in such a way that actually gets their art out into the world and that they can hopefully live a life. There's all sorts of complications and problems with this. Anybody who knows how much artists tend to make from releasing their music on Spotify knows that this is not by any means a perfect system. Anybody who's ever had to buy a textbook for a course and be like, okay, it's saltines and ramen for the rest of the month, also knows that there's a problem. And anybody who's ever had to negotiate a license for a large commercial publisher also knows that this is not a perfect system. A license to access a journal from a large commercial publisher knows that this is not a perfect system. I can go into all sorts of different history and background about that if you want to learn more, but I'm not going to do it now. Ultimately, what gives the companies and the publishers the power to charge those prices is copyright. That's the area of IP that gives them the legal right to stop other people from copying it without their consent. That was the traditional model, but oh wait, the internet happened. And all of a sudden, instead of needing to like print all of these things and get people to carry actual like physical meat space books and journals from one place to another, we have an extremely cheap distribution system that we call the extremely cheap distribution channel called the internet. We can now redistribute. We can enable others to redistribute information incredibly easy, incredibly quickly, and trivially far. And I don't mean trivially I mean like arbitrarily far is the word that I'm looking for. So people were all obviously asked the question, why am I still giving copyright to these journals or to this textbook publisher if all of this information can just be beamed all the way across the world for free and everybody should be able to access it super easily? But in order to enable a new way of doing things, we needed new forms of IP, or at least new ways of limiting copyright that existed before. And that's where Creative Commons licenses came from. You've probably heard of a Creative Commons license before. If you've ever published anything open access, you've probably gone to the point where they say like, please select a license. And you go, that one. It's not something that a lot of people, if you ever are in that position, please go ask your librarians. Librarians know a schwack ton about all of this. And in none of this talk do I want to like disparage the fact that both librarians and technology transfer officers play a really important function at universities. So, but Creative Commons licenses and came about to enable people, remember, you're the owner of a piece of copyright once you've written something down. What a license is basically like, okay, I'm the owner, but I'm going to give you permission to do X or Y or Z. When it comes to Creative Commons, you can go all the way from Creative Commons 0, which is basically like, I'm giving up copyright, down to Creative Commons BY, which is an attribution license. So you can use this for whatever you want, as long as you credit me for when you use it and redistribute it. You can go to share alike. I can go into all these licenses later if you want. Non-commercial, no derivatives, which I'm not personally a big fan of, but whatever. We can talk about that more later if you want. And then right at the end there is full copyright, all rights reserved. Through these new intellectual property tools, these Creative Commons licenses, new ways of doing things. I'm sure every single one of you has heard, probably ad nauseum at this point, about open access. So I don't need to talk too much about that, but the whole point is, if it's open access, other people should be able to access it for free, and they should also be able to send it to their friend for free, or to take little pieces of it and put it into a talk, for example, for free. This is all made possible by the fact that you have to apply a Creative Commons license to your work, or you transfer it to the publisher and they have to apply it. It's kind of a little complication. I prefer it to be not that way, but sometimes that's the way the cookie crumbles. And there are more and more diamond open access journals happening at any given time. I don't know if you know this. In fact, I am up here repping McGill's Geophysical Sciences Diamond Open Access Journal, Seismica, that they started with the help of the McGill libraries. And I saw they were selling swag on Mastodon, and I thought, I'm going to get me some of that. I don't need Nike. Get out of here, Adidas. Seismica. And then there are other different models too. There are open textbooks. I don't know if you've ever heard of OpenStax before, but instead of spending a bunch of time writing a textbook and then sending it to Macmillan and Macmillan charging $300 for it, you can write a textbook with OpenStax, which was an initiative that kind of came out of Rice University, that distributes textbooks for free. So you can download them for free. You can access them digitally online, or if you want a really nicely bound copy of it, you can pay about $50, which is significantly less than most of the textbooks that you have to interact with. I have a good friend who became a paramedic about 5 years ago. His entire education to become a paramedic was done through OpenStax textbooks. And he was very happy about not having to spend $300 for every single class to get a different textbook, and not being able to use the old version because for some reason the publishing company has changed the numbers on the pages, and that's literally the only thing that they've changed. So all of a sudden you can't refer to the right thing from the syllabus. Okay, so we've talked about copyright. Now let's talk about patents. Where copyright is about protecting the ability to copy and redistribute a piece of expression, it's not about protecting the ability to use knowledge. If you read a new paper that was distributed to you from a publisher through the power of copyright, you're still allowed to use that knowledge for anything that you want. You're still allowed to, they're not limiting you from being able to apply what you learn to create a new tool, create a new mouse line, design a new experiment, doesn't matter. Patents exist to do that. They exist to control the use of knowledge, particularly within an economic domain. So there are exceptions to copyright, mainly fair use or fair dealing, depending on what jurisdiction you're in. Please ask your librarian about that. There are also exceptions to patent law. I'm not going to get too much into it, but basically, if you want to use a piece of patented knowledge in any way that could either make money or interfere with the owner's ability to make money, you have to pay the owner, come to some form of an agreement with the owner so that they give you a license or you buy it. They have slightly different details, or significantly different details, than copyright. If granted, so you actually have to apply for a patent. It doesn't automatically happen like copyright. They last for 20 years from the filing date, if granted. By de facto, they owned the inventor, or they are owned by the inventor. But that whether or not that continues to happen really depends on what your employment contract looks like. So I don't know if any of you have ever actually read your employment contract, or the innovation policies that exist at your particular institution. I encourage you to do so. It depends, it differs depending on whether you're a student, whether you're creating something for a class, you've created it using the materials that are available to you or on your own time. But all of that to say, generally speaking, if you are the inventor, you own it. You're the only one who's allowed to exploit it economically. Filing a patent and getting it can take a really long time. You file, and then what's called patent prosecution, which is just the process of basically paying a lawyer to be like, grant this patent, please hurry things up. And that can take, it's often 2, 3 longer years. And they last for 20 years from the filing date. And please do poke me if I'm taking too long. So we have the patent bargain, once again. We've got, it costs money to come up with applicable ideas that you can use, both upfront and downstream. So the idea is that if you are going to put that money in, you want some assurance that other people aren't just going to be able to go like, oh, they put all that money in and now we have this knowledge and now I'm going to apply it and use it myself. It means that other people can't come in and trim your margins without having to pay those costs. And they can be super duper 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 valuable. If you've never looked it up, you should. The original Genentech patent, which was basically like the method for creating transgenic organisms, was granted to Genentech. That's one of the most valuable patents in the history of ever, right? If you want to take DNA from one organism and put it into another organism for pretty much any purpose, Genentech had the original patent that covered that. And that was, their valuation went to the moon. But there are risks and there are downsides when it comes to patenting. And like, don't get me wrong, the traditional patenting approach has worked in the past. A lot of the drugs that you're able to have access to now exist because people patented them and took the traditional path to be able to get through the FDA, through clinical trials, which are stupidly expensive. It's on the order of hundreds of millions of dollars, generally speaking, to be able to get through. So I don't want to come up here and just straight up badmouth patents. They do have risks, especially in the context of open science. We're supposed to be sharing things. I am getting back to open science, I promise, after we get past through the crash course. First of all, you have to keep all the information behind it and the idea secret while you're preparing the patent and while you're filing it. Because one of the criteria for getting a patent is it has to be new, 2 other criteria, new, and it has to be non-obvious, which means that the idea can't have been published before, and a person of ordinary skill in the art, which is another one of these legal terms of art, shouldn't be able to cobble together your invention from the information that already exists out there in the world. So if you share information, including data, including protocols, including a whole bunch of the things that went into your idea, if that all of a sudden makes it so that a person of ordinary skill in the art, which is a skilled technician without imagination, which is somehow a standard that a judge has to apply with the help of experts, but let's put that aside for now. If you share it, it will make it unpatentable, and all of a sudden you're in trouble, which means that if you're supposed to share stuff, if you want to publish a preprint, if you want to do all this, you have to wait until you are done creating a patent, paying all the lawyers and whatnot to be able to write it up. And I'm talking like $10,000, whether you do it yourself or go to a university tech transfer office to do it. As soon as you have the patent, it makes collaboration difficult. You've got to have a licensing agreement with anybody who wants to use your technology. You've got to have NDAs. All of that stuff requires lawyers, and lawyers are expensive. As someone who's gone to law school and has many friends who are lawyers, I'm not here to badmouth them, but they are not cheap. They are not something that adding a lawyer to a collaboration never makes it faster and never makes it cheaper. Having a patent doesn't guarantee that you can do anything. Having a patent is an enforceable negative right. You can stop other people from doing things. It doesn't grant you some magical ability to actually make your thing. You actually have to have an economic case to be made. Without a strong business case, without saying, I'm going to be able to use this enforceable negative right that I have to create an innovation that is going to interact with the market in such a way that it's going to produce a profit, it is extreme. They're worse than useless. They've been expensive to get. You have to pay maintenance costs, which means that you have to continue to pay over the life of the patent in order for it to continue to exist. And getting the patent itself, depending on how long it takes, is like I said, on the order of $10,000. It really depends. I can't give you a hardcore number on that, and it takes a really long time, and it takes lawyers. Just take my word for it. It's a sunk cost that, if you don't have a really good business case, has just made whatever company or endeavor you're trying to do worse off. This is why conscience specifically concentrates on areas where they don't work, but I'll skip that up for now. What I wanted to talk about is, here's an alternative to enforcing patents in the context of making medicine. So I want to talk about making medicines first. In order to understand this, in order to explain it, I need to explain regulatory exclusivities. I promise to make this as painless as possible. When you apply for approval of a drug, depending on your jurisdiction, if it gets and depending on the type of drug, if it gets approved, you can get something called a regulatory exclusivity. They come in two types: a data exclusivity and a market exclusivity. Data exclusivity means that no one else is allowed to use the data that you've generated in your clinical trials to prove equivalence. Proving equivalence is how generics tend to enter a market, right? If you're nearing the end of a patent term on a really effective, really important molecule, really important drug, a generic manufacturer, in order to deliver an equivalent molecule, can do something called an abbreviated clinical trial, which is way cheaper. And they don't have to prove all the same levels of efficacy and safety and all of that. They just have to prove that it works equivalently with the existing thing on the market. If you have data exclusivity, you have protection. Other people can't do that. If you have market exclusivity, it means that these only apply in the context of like rare diseases. So they're not for any type of medicine. But if you're working in the areas of rare diseases, you can, other people are not allowed to sell the same molecule for the same indication because the FDA simply won't approve it for a certain period of time. These exist differently in different jurisdictions. There's different time frames, but putting those details aside, they have some distinct advantages. First of all, they don't cost any money. Once you've got your drug approved, they're free. They automatically get granted. You don't have to enforce them. With a patent, if you own the patent and someone else infringes, you have to come in and enforce the patent against them. You have to threaten to sue them. And they don't require secrecy. This company, M4K, is currently developing several drugs, and Conscience is helping fund them. So I guess conflict of interest there, but I'm presenting it. They're developing a drug, one in particular, for DIPG, which is a childhood brain cancer, terrible outcomes. And they thought, okay, these regulatory exclusivities that were originally created to deal with the problem that like patents sometimes run out before you get to the market. So what we're going to do is tack on these regulatory exclusivities. They're like, wait a second, what if we just don't patent and only use the regulatory exclusivities once it's granted? What that means is that you don't have to keep things secret, because you don't need a patent in order to get a regulatory exclusivity. You don't need a bunch of lawyers to be negotiating between one another for licensing, because the intellectual property, it is a form of intellectual property, I would argue, but it springs into existence later on in the process, and it's much more targeted. Where a patent restricts the use of knowledge in like any domain in the market, data exclusivity says you're just not allowed to use it for this particular use, which means you're just not allowed to use it for approving equivalence. You're allowed to use the data for other things. Market exclusivity says you're not allowed to sell this equivalent molecule for this particular indication, but if someone wants to use that molecule or create a new derivative of that molecule for another indication, go ahead. They're allowed to do that. I'm not going to talk about priority review vouchers because I've already been talking for long enough. they are a type of intellectual property that is much more compatible with open science, with the idea of collaborating easily and seamlessly with one another, with enabling other people to take ideas and materials and move forward with them and go running with them, and with sharing the resources that underlie all of your work. M4K publishes all of its meetings and all of its data online. As they come out, there are a big consortium of labs that work all over the place that are all working on this particular drug. And if you really want to get a deep dive into it later this month, we'll be sharing the talk that they just gave at the Conscience Symposium. I warn you, it's pretty deep in the economic weeds, but if you're really into the time value of money, I very much encourage you to have a look. Disadvantages, not available everywhere, not available for every indication, not available for every molecule, shorter protection horizon, less broad protection, but like I said, that's kind of the point. And they're an untested business strategy. M4K is like the first that's trying to just develop a drug based on this particular business strategy. So it's a little bit uncertain whether people will invest in it, because people like to invest in stuff that they've seen before. I'm not going to take too long on this because you probably all heard of open source software before. So we talked about making medicines. Now we're talking about making software. Now, before anybody who's watching this in the future or online gets mad at me, I am aware that the type of intellectual property that generally covers patents and that open source licenses are aimed to deal with is copyright. But software patents exist. And if you're going to have a software company, an IP lawyer will tell you, to get a software patent, and the best open source licenses also include patent grant components in them. So they deal not just with copyright, but with patent. But I'm only saying all of that to say that when it comes to things like Red Hat and WordPress, these are massive companies. Red Hat is distributes Linux. It got acquired by IBM for many millions of dollars a while back. It's an open source company. It provides services around it. Open source means you share the code, anybody can use it. Anybody can pick it up, they can take it, they can reproduce it, they can modify it, they can install it on their own system. They don't have to pay Red Hat anything, but if you want, or the people who created it, anything. But if you want services around it, if you want it installed on your particular hardware, if you want people to provide tech support, that's what Red Hat charges for. They make a lot of money. WordPress operates on a similar basis. Deep Lab Cut is not a company, but I wanted to bring it up because it's relevant to neuroscience research. I don't know if anybody in the lab have used it. It's also open source. I think it could be spun out as a company and developed on an open source business model like nobody's business, but the people who are maintaining it, the people who created it, have no interest in doing that. And then OpenFold, which just also got presented at the Conscience Symposium, is an open source equivalent competitor for AlphaFold. It's roughly got the capacities of AlphaFold 3, and in fact has recently been decided by a consortium of pharmaceutical companies that they're going to use OpenFold to create their own kind of like in-house protein folding and ligand binding event or initiative. Another thing, very briefly, I want to touch on this. You can ask me more about this later if you want. But Conscience, maybe, hopefully, we've been talking to and might work with a company called vNext. They're in California. They're trying to do an open source ecosystem for synthetic biology, which is like cellular pathways in a tube rather than in a cell. I just think that's super duper cool. The idea of, if you go to the basis of like cell theories, right? Like cells come from cells is one of the three fundamental tenets of cell theory, but they're trying to buck against that. They're trying to go from the inorganic to the organic. A cell has trillions of little molecular mechanisms in it and little machines that are able to do stuff. Obviously, a test tube can't be equivalent to that, but with every new synthetic module that gets added, every new different type of ribosome, every new plasmid, every new phospholipid that they can add into that, it gets more and more and more valuable. Their business proposition is that they have a network effect whereby each particular addition to this cohort of molecules and this cohort of little or whatever proteins, is able to increase the value of each other one. And they want to make this totally in the open. They want to share all the information that underlies it. If you want to buy their kits, if you want a particular cellular pathway in a tube, you can pay them. They're going to have quality controls. They're going to be able to do it well. They've got the experts. They've got all the labs that are able to do it. But if you want to do it in your own lab, you can download it yourself. And if you want to contribute to it, you can, with something else that you created for your master's degree and your PhD or something like that, that you think would be useful, they've got a contributor layer that you can contribute in. And one of the reasons they want to make it open is that if you have to make, they've got people contributing from like 50 different universities all over the world. If you have to make a licensing agreement with each one of those universities all over the world, that would stop innovation immediately. They would leave and not be able to be the company that they want to be and not be able to create the industry of synthetic biology that they want to be able to create. Now we're going to talk about data very briefly, very shortly. This isn't quite as relevant, or this part of the talk isn't quite as relevant to what you do, because we end up talking about if you're doing science and you're generating data and you want other people, if you want to call it science, if you want to call it something that's as sciencey as you possibly can, you should be sharing the underlying information so that other people can generate the results that you have reported in your publication. That's kind of one of the underlying like basic tenets of what makes science function in society. It's what makes it social. So trade secrets doesn't apply as much to the academic world. But if you go into the private world, well, it doesn't apply to the academic world unless you want to access a proprietary data set. So unless you want to go to a company and say, I want access to this, ligand file, or I want access to this Dell library or something like that, and you have to pay big sums of money and sign their contracts, the thing it's an incredibly valuable asset for them. We're going to talk about trade secrets in just a second. That's the type of intellectual property that applies there. I want to bring up these companies for just a second. I don't know, how many of you remember Celera? Hey, we got one. This was the one that tried to compete with the Human Genome Project. They were the private company that was trying to compete with the Human Genome Project, and they were patenting genes all over the place. But they were also publishing. And the reason this is interesting is that when they were publishing, they were trying to okay, we're going to share some of the data that underlies this publication, but we're also going to keep some of this data in a private thing that people have to pay for. And this made everybody very mad in the scientific community, and was one of the things that drove Francis Collins and the NIH to say, you know what, no, we're not gonna let these guys win. We're gonna share this. This should be part of the common heritage of humanity. Like OG open science is the Human Genome Project. There's also Myriad Genetics, and I've got a fascinating story about this too. How many of you have heard of Myriad Genetics? No. They were the ones who they were a Utah company. They had the patent on the BRCA gene. How many of you know about the BRCA gene, breast cancer gene? They used this patent to say they're the only ones who are allowed to do tests on the BRCA gene. And it was eventually invalidated in a very famous case called AMP v. Myriad that was tried down in the United States. And the United States said, no, you're not allowed to patent a gene. You would have thought that would have made Myriad fall off a cliff and completely disappear. But that's not what happened. Because during the period of time of the patent, and when they were doing all of the testing, they were able to develop a highly valuable data set of all of the different mutations of the BRCA gene that were correlated with particular clinical outcomes. So they were the only ones who knew, because they were the only ones that were allowed to offer it, that it's not just one mutation that can cause cancer in the BRCA gene. It's also, I don't know how many there are, but there's all sorts of different mutations in the BRCA gene. that can lead to different clinical outcomes, can increase or decrease your risk of breast cancer and ovarian cancer by a particular amount. That was a hugely valuable asset, and that was protected by trade secret. I've got a fun little thing. There was one place in the world that when Myriad was trying to enforce its patent and say you're not allowed to run tests for the BRCA gene, what country in the world do you think called their bluff? Said, no, we're going to continue to do it. Canada, Ontario. They said, you know what? No, come at me. I don't think your patent is valid. And Myriad eventually backed down because they knew that under the normal patenting guidelines, which say that things like mathematical functions and naturally occurring phenomena are not patentable. They're not inventions. They're just things that you found, discoveries. So they called their bluff on it. Admittedly, I have to admit this as someone who comes from BC, BC folded, Alberta folded, Quebec unfortunately folded, but Ontario said, no, we're going to continue to do the testing, and eventually Myriad backed down and didn't try to do it. And then eventually the Association of Molecular Pathologists, AMP in the United States, challenged the patent and got all gene patents invalidated. Hurrah. And then the last thing I'll say is that 23andMe, I don't know if you've heard about this, went through some big problems, and now one of the biggest assets within the company is, I mean, I don't know if you're in the 23andMe database, but is you. Basically, is your genetic information, and or at least all of the particular tests that they do, all of the information that comes from the particular tests that they do, they have all of that information, and they filed for bankruptcy. So that's the major asset within the company, and that's covered by trade secrets. If you have information that has potential value in a market, and you have taken measures to keep it secret, you've got people to sign NDAs and confidentiality agreements and whatever, voila, you have a trade secret. They're automatic, they last forever, but if someone else comes across the same information as you, is able to generate it themselves, then poof, your trade secret goes away. You can't enforce a trade secret against them. This is the thing. It's only protection if you keep it secret. What it protects you from doing is other people, like people at your company or whatnot, taking the information that's of great value and leaving and going and selling it to another company. One of the only reasons I've been talking about all of this for so long is it lets me talk about a couple of topics that I really like talking about. One is fair data, which I'm probably heard of before: findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable. One is open data, and we're going to get to AI ready data in just a second. I probably don't need to go too much into this, but one of the things that makes data valuable, and I'm not talking about money value at this point, though these things are correlated. I'm talking about like valuable for the sake of doing science, is how it's organized, how it's findable, how accessible it is, how interoperable it is with other types of data, and how reusable it is. Technically, and of course, how open it is, so whether people can access it. Now, there's a difference between these two things, and this is something that I explain to people all the time. Because something is fair doesn't mean that it's open. If something's fair, it means that the way to find it is something that is human and machine readable. Think before AI, machine readable. Some very clear instructions about where to find it, how to access it, how to interoperate with it, and how to reuse it. The instructions for doing so are very, very clear. And 5 minutes? Cool. Almost there. I promise. And then, so you can technically have a closed data set that's totally fair, because the way that you access it is by paying for it. But the instructions for accessing it are very, very clear. It's interoperable. It's still behind a paywall, but it's in a format such that it's interoperable with other forms of data that exist out there in the world. And it's reusable on the terms that are very clearly set out, which could mean people have to pay for it. It's about data organization, not data availability. Open is about data availability. As all of you also probably know, something can be open and not fair. Something can just be generated and splashed out onto the internet, in which case it is of relatively limited usefulness. If you want your data to be valuable, both in terms of money, which you're not doing so much in academia, but take a note, and in terms of value to the scientific community, making it as open as you can, making it as fair as you can is the best way of doing that. And the last thing I'm going to talk about is what's called the fourth paradigm of data, which is a really fancy way of saying the way of thinking about data in the future in the world of AI that exists right now is to think about the computer as a machine is the first user of your data. So it's in the old way of thinking, you think the first user of your data is going to be a person and they are going to feed it potentially into a program. Now, the first user of your data is going to be a piece of AI that someone's going to scrape and someone's going to train. This is important for a couple of reasons and a couple of things that I want to talk about in just the last minutes of this talk. One, in this context, in order to make your data as valuable as possible, you need to organize. It needs to be fair. It needs to be as well organized as possible, because as amazing as AI is, the old software adage of garbage in, garbage out still applies. The better curated your data is beforehand, the better the output and the better the training of your model is going to be. There's a company that exists to work with scientists to make their data what they call fair squared, which is fair and AI ready. It's SenScience. It was actually started or co-founded by Sean Hill, who used to be at the Krembil Center for Neuroinformatics at CAMH. So he was big into the open science world there, and then he founded SenScience. I don't know much about them as a company, but I've been seeing these posts on LinkedIn, and one of the ways of making it most valuable, of making your data most valuable, is to make it machine readable and really AI ready. Okay, I know that was a lot, but I'm hoping that right now you feel a little bit more grounded in the context of what IP is, how it relates to your various different outputs and activities as a researcher, how translation has worked in the past and how it could work in the future, and are feeling somewhat ready to stretch your translational imagination. Because if you go to a tech transfer office, and I love them and they're great, but oftentimes they have a patent hammer and everything looks like a patent nail or doesn't look like a patent nail, and they're not interested in it. And they're not necessarily tooled to help you take advantage of all of the different paths of translation that exist now out in the world because of the internet, because of the open science movement, and because of hopefully the dedication of folks like y'all. Thanks, and I'm more than happy to take some questions.